There is a moment on the night of May 2nd, 1863, in a dark tangle of Virginia woodland called the Wilderness, that does not fit the story everyone thinks they know. A general kneels beside another general who has just been shot by his own men. He presses cloth against the wound. He talks to him steadily, trying to keep him conscious, trying to keep him alive. That kneeling general is A.P. Hill. The wounded man is Stonewall Jackson. And if you only knew one fact about their relationship, you might assume this was two brothers in arms, bonded by years of mutual respect, watching the worst night of the war unfold together. That is not the relationship these two men had. The same general kneeling in the dark had, months earlier, handed Jackson his own sword in a fit of rage and dared him to take it. The same general had been placed under arrest by Jackson not once, but repeatedly, charged with dereliction of duty on 8 separate occasions. The same general had written to a mutual friend and called Jackson, in language that was not affectionate, that crazy Presbyterian fool. So which is it? Did A.P. Hill despise Stonewall Jackson, or did he love him? The honest answer is more interesting than either, and it starts, like so many Confederate rivalries did, at West Point. The West Point rivalry. Ambrose Powell Hill and Thomas Jonathan Jackson entered the United States Military Academy in the same class in 1842. On paper, they should have been natural allies. Both were Virginians. Both would go on to become two of the most important generals the Confederacy produced. In practice, they never got along, not even as cadets. Hill came from money and status. He liked company, liked leisure, liked the social pleasures a young man away from home might reasonably enjoy. Jackson was almost the opposite of all of it, devout to the point of severity, humorless by reputation, uninterested in anything that looked like levity. By some accounts, Hill and a few of his friends tried, briefly, to draw Jackson into their circle, decided he simply wasn't worth the effort, and gave up. Hill went on to graduate in 1847, a year behind his original class, after an illness forced him to repeat a year. Jackson graduated in the class ahead of him. Neither man thought much of the other, and neither expected their paths to cross again in any meaningful way. The Civil War made that expectation obsolete. The 7 days, where the real trouble began. By the summer of 1862, both men were Confederate generals in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and Hill was commanding his newly famous Light Division during the 7 days battles outside Richmond. This is where most historians trace the beginning of the real professional dispute. At Mechanicsville and at Gaines' Mill, Hill's division took brutal casualties in attacks that, by his own judgment, were not properly supported by the rest of the army, including by Jackson's command, which arrived late and performed with uncharacteristic sluggishness after an exhausting march down from the Shenandoah Valley. Hill believed he had been left to bleed. He was not shy about saying so. That resentment did not stay contained to Jackson alone. In the aftermath of the 7 days, Hill's temper found an even more immediate target in James Longstreet, after a series of newspaper articles inflamed tensions between their staffs. The dispute escalated so far that Hill was placed under arrest and actually challenged Longstreet to a duel. Robert Lee, unwilling to lose two of his most capable commanders to a pistol at 10 paces, resolved the crisis the only way that made strategic sense. He transferred Hill's division away from Longstreet. He sent it to Stonewall Jackson. It was, in hindsight, something like pulling a man out of one fire and setting him down directly in another. The Sword Incident. Jackson's command style was built on total, unquestioning obedience, delivered without explanation. He rarely told his subordinates what the larger plan was. He expected them to execute orders exactly as given, and he had almost no patience for improvisation, even improvisation that made tactical sense in the moment. Hill, who had just come from a chain of command he found stifling, walked directly into a stricter one. The breaking point came during the march towards 2nd Manassas in the late summer of 1862. Frustrated by Jackson's criticism of straggling in his ranks, Hill pushed his men hard, skipping the standard rest breaks. The pace only made the straggling worse. When Jackson personally halted one of Hill's brigades without going through Hill first, Hill rode back to confront him directly. What happened next became one of the most quoted exchanges of the war. Hill dismounted, presented Jackson with the hilt of his sword, and told him that if he intended to command Hill's troops in Hill's own presence, he might as well take his sword along with them. Jackson's reply was ice. He told Hill to put his sword away and consider himself under arrest. Hill spent the following days marching at the rear of his own division as a prisoner of his own command structure, humiliated in front of the men he led. It took an intervention from one of Jackson's own staff officers to get Hill reinstated in time to fight. It would not be the last time. A pattern of arrests. Over the following months, Jackson filed dereliction of duty charges against Hill on 8 separate occasions. Hill, for his part, repeatedly petitioned Lee for a formal court of inquiry to clear his name once and for all. Lee refused every time. He knew exactly what he had in these two men. One of them, a brilliant, ferocious division commander, the other an equally brilliant corps commander with an unmatched instinct for the decisive strike. And he was not willing to let personal friction dissolve a partnership that kept winning battles. Because that is the part of this story that makes it genuinely strange. Whatever Hill privately thought of Jackson, and by his own words to J.E.B. Stuart, he did not think much of him personally, dismissing him in one letter as that crazy Presbyterian fool. None of it stopped him from fighting like his life depended on Jackson's success. And in more than one battle, it did. Cedar Mountain, redemption under fire. At Cedar Mountain in August of 1862, Jackson's assault against Union forces under Nathaniel Banks nearly collapsed. It was Hill's light division, arriving at exactly the right moment, that stabilized the crumbling Confederate left flank and turned near disaster into a narrow victory. There was a particular satisfaction in it for Hill. One of the broken Union-facing units he shored up that day belonged to what had once been Jackson's own famous Stonewall Brigade. The feud did not end there. It simply went quiet for as long as the guns were firing. Antietam, the march that saved an army. The clearest proof of how Hill actually operated came weeks later. During the invasion of Maryland, Lee's army was dangerously divided, and Hill's division, the same division still technically under a cloud of arrest from Jackson, was left behind at Harper's Ferry to finalize a Union surrender while the rest of the army moved toward Sharpsburg. When word came that Lee's remaining forces were about to be overwhelmed at Antietam Creek, Hill force-marched his men across roughly 17 miles of Maryland countryside in under 8 hours, arrived on the field in the middle of the afternoon, and threw his exhausted troops directly into the fight. His attack helped save Lee's army from what could have been a catastrophic, war-ending defeat. He did this while still furious with the very command structure he was fighting to preserve. That contradiction is the entire relationship in miniature. Hill's personal contempt and his professional discipline occupied the same body and somehow never cancelled each other out. The feud that would not die. The pattern held for the rest of 1862 and into 1863. Fight beside each other, win the battle, and resume the argument the moment the smoke cleared. Hill's frustration with Jackson's secrecy, his refusal to explain plans, his rigid insistence on obedience without context, never fully dissolved. Lee, at one point, quietly urged Jackson to share more of his thinking with his subordinate commanders. Jackson, characteristically, ignored the suggestion entirely. By the spring of 1863, the two men had been locked in this cycle of professional collaboration and personal friction for the better part of a year. Neither had backed down. Neither had asked to be separated from the other. Not really. Hill's requests for a court of inquiry were about clearing his name, not escaping Jackson's command. Whatever this relationship was, it was not simple hatred. It was something closer to two extremely talented, extremely stubborn men who had never learned to like each other and never stopped needing each other. Then came Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville, the reckoning. On the night of May 2nd, 1863, Jackson led one of the most audacious flank attacks of the entire war, catching the Union 11th Corps completely by surprise and rolling it up in the failing light. Riding ahead of his own lines after dark to scout the position further, Jackson was mistaken for Union cavalry and shot by soldiers from his own side, soldiers from Hill's division. Hill was nearby when it happened. Whatever resentment had built up over the previous year did not survive the moment. Accounts describe him rushing to Jackson's side, horrified at what his own men had done, working urgently to help however he could as the wounded general was carried from the field. For those hours, the feud simply did not exist anymore. There was only one general trying to keep another general alive. Hill briefly assumed command of Jackson's Second Corps that same night before he too was wounded, forced to hand control to J.E.B. Stuart. Jackson would linger for several more days before dying of complications on May 10th. In his final hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, one of his last coherent orders was directed at the very man he had arrested 8 times over the previous year. Order A.P. Hill to prepare for action. Historians still debate what Jackson meant by it. Whether it was a final vote of confidence in Hill's fighting ability or one last quiet comment on the marching discipline that had started their feud in the first place, no one can say for certain. Jackson took the answer with him. What he truly thought. So what did A.P. Hill actually think of Stonewall Jackson? The evidence does not point to hatred, and it does not point to admiration either, at least not the uncomplicated kind. Hill thought Jackson was secretive to the point of insult, rigid to the point of cruelty, and pious in a way he found genuinely irritating. He said so, plainly, in his own words, more than once. He was arrested by the man 8 times and never fully forgave the humiliation of any of them. And yet, when Jackson's plans needed defending, Hill defended them with his own division's blood. When Jackson's flank was collapsing, Hill's men were the ones who held it. When Lee's entire army was one bad afternoon away from destruction, it was Hill who marched 17 miles in a single day to prevent it. And when Jackson lay dying in the dark, shot by the very soldiers Hill commanded, it was Hill who stayed beside him, trying to keep him talking, trying to keep him alive. That is the truth this relationship actually offers, and it is a more honest one than a simple story of rivalry or a simple story of brotherhood could ever provide. A.P. Hill did not need to like Stonewall Jackson to fight for him with everything he had. 2 men who never resolved their contempt for each other built, without ever calling it friendship, one of the most effective command partnerships the Confederacy fielded during the entire war. History rarely offers relationships this complicated between men remembered as legends. This one survived 8 arrests, a sword drawn in anger, and a private letter calling one of them a fool, and it still ended with one holding the other's hand as he died.